Welcome to Power Tools, a podcast for energy managers, enthusiasts, and those responsible for keeping energy costs in check to discuss important topics related to power management in Ontario, Canada. My name is Carver of Workbench Energy. Workbench Energy provides a suite of power and carbon services for large power consumers and distributed energy resources to help your organization earn more, learn more, and emit less. So today's our inaugural podcast for Power Tools, and we're discussing one of the major drivers of power costs, innovation, and investment in Ontario, the global adjustment. So the global adjustment makes up approximately 50% of the 18 billion costs it takes to run the power grid each year, and those costs need to be recovered by those of us who pay for electricity. And so a consequence of the global adjustment is how it's encouraged innovation in pursuit of folks trying to lower their power bills by avoiding using power at peak times. So how did the global adjustment get to this point, and where are we at today? What does the future hold for the global adjustment? So joining me today is Lampe of Workbench Energy. In addition to being my business partner, Aaron leads Ontario's best-in-class peak prediction service, Energy Peaks. He also oversees the commercial market operations team at Workbench Energy, where we manage a variety of different distributed energy resources, including responsive loads, storage systems, and generators. Nice to see you, Aaron.
Thanks, Cam. Excited to be here. Excited to be getting this kicked off and talking about some of the things we're super interested in and topics, and hope other people also find them interesting.
Great. So today we're going to talk about the global adjustment. So
the big one. Everyone always wants to hear about global adjustment.
They do. And there's a lot to talk about here. So maybe we can just start with getting into, for those who may not be totally familiar with the global adjustment. What is it? It's an Ontario phenomenon, at least in name. Can you take us through what it is?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I think that's worth starting there, right, and setting that, because we hear about a lot, it's talked about a lot, and I think generally it's not well understood. So at its basic, global adjustment is an accounting entry in the Ontario electricity rate structure. And it's an account that captures the differences in the payments that we make to the generators, that we have to make to the generators on a monthly basis to make them whole versus the revenue they make selling electricity in the market. And so in order to get a generator built, to have someone build a new natural gas or nuclear unit or wind or solar, and to have them comfortable to spend that money, the grid operator provides them with a long-term contract. Maybe that's 10 years, maybe that's 20 years, maybe that's 30 years. And that contract says, hey, if you go build this generator and then you generate power, you'll get paid for the power you generate. But how much you get paid is subject to how has the market fluctuated. What are the dynamics? It can go up and it can go down. And that can be really difficult to attract investment, to have someone put up all that cash up front. And so typically those contracts say, okay, you're going to get paid for the power you generate. But if it's not enough, we will guarantee you a minimum amount of revenue. We'll guarantee you that you'll get paid a certain amount. And essentially for all types of generators in the province, again, nuclear, hydroelectric, wind, solar, gas, for a variety of reasons, the amount they make selling energy in the Ontario market isn't enough to get them to that minimum revenue point. So at the end of the month, the IESO, who operates the grid here in Ontario, has to say, okay, you made $500,000 this month, but your minimum revenue was $1 million. We have to write you a check for $500,000. And the global adjustment account is all of those checks added together that have brought those generators to their minimum revenue, and it's those costs. And the reason we need that account is somehow, some way, those costs have to be paid for. And so the global adjustment account tracks it throughout the month, and then those costs are allocated to the ratepayers in a variety of mechanisms. What's interesting is because the global adjustment amount, the amount we owe to the generators at the end of the month, is actually related to the energy price, but it's an inverse relationship. So if the energy prices are really high in a month, then the generators make more money in the market, and the checks that the ISO has to write them at the end of the month to bring them up to their minimum revenue are smaller. If energy is really inexpensive in the month, then they don't make much money in the market, and those checks get really big. So as energy prices in Ontario go up, global adjustment goes down, and vice versa. Global adjustment has been around for a while now, and I would say historically speaking, it's grown from a very small point. Actually, started as a rebate, and it had grown quite consistently over the first couple decades since 2000, and sort of over year was growing. More recently, it had started to kind of stabilize, and then even more recently in 2021, we saw a large drop, almost around 30% drop in the global adjustment, as the government made a decision to move some of the costs that were in global adjustment, the costs associated with some of the renewable energy contracts, out of the electricity rate base and into the tax base. And so as a result, we've seen a shift in that trend. And now over the last couple of years, it's started to become fairly stable as the supply mix has been stable and the market relatively stable. So I think that's an overview. Anything, Cam, you can think of I may have missed in the basics of what is the global adjustment account?
No, I think I mean that's a great summary. We have seen that global adjustment account rise, roughly in line with sort of the build out of renewables over the past couple of decades. And what you're saying is that renewables are a portion of the global adjustment cost, but not all of it. So there's other components to the GA. So maybe you can just give us a sense of how that fits. And also, I guess the other one is the conservation and demand management programs that also fit into GA. So there's some things outside of the generators that kind of get bucketed into the global adjustment.
Yeah, for sure. So sometimes you'll hear, oh, global adjustment is all because of the coal phase out and renewable energy rollout. There's no question that the retirement of the coal and then adding renewable generation is a significant factor in the growth of GA over time, but it's far from the only factor. As I mentioned, inside of that GA account are payments to all types of resources. And so if you look at that on a monthly or annual basis, essentially every type of resource we have in the province can be found costs associated with them. So, in province, we have a lot of nukes, we have a lot of hydroelectric, gas resources are in there. We are still covering some of the costs of the retirement of the coal, although I think that's ramping down fairly quickly at this point. And then, of course, wind, solar, biomass, those kind of things. Those are all in there. Now, you did mention CDM, demand management aspects. There's also those programs are also in there. They're not a huge line item, but those exist as well in that stack. So it's made up a bunch of things. And so I mentioned how the government made a decision to move costs out of GA that are associated with the renewable wind. I think it was wind, solar, and biomass. And so that dropped GA by about 30%, but we still have 70% in there. And so most of those costs that are still remaining that are in the rate base are associated with the other types of assets. So it would be an oversimplification for sure. And we sometimes hear it that, GA is because of the renewable build out. That is a factor, a significant factor, but yeah, definitely not all of it.
Right. And so in terms of how customers experience GAs, and they experience them on their bills, depending on the type of customer that you are, you're going to see that come differently. So can you talk about how GA is allocated to different types of customers in Ontario?
For sure. This is where it gets interesting, right? So now we have this huge, I'll say huge, right? Account that we have to allocate to the customers. And so largely speaking, let me start with you and I at our house, right? Everyone pays their utility bill. And we're on what's called the regulated price plan, RPP customers. That's residential people, small bills. And that's our our cost of power is very stable day to day, month to month, and they're typically set in 6 to 12 month periods where it just doesn't change. And for years we had what is called time of use, right? So overnight we have a low rate, then a mid rate, and then a high rate, but every day it's the same. Really buried deep into it, when they set those rates for every 6 or 12 month period, they're projecting what the global adjustment is going to be and then what the share should be for you, me, and all the other residential customers. But it's really buried in there. We don't see it. It doesn't fluctuate. And that's because we're a regulated price plan. It's not allowed to float. I will note that recently, I think it was a year ago or so, the current government introduced additional options for RPP customers. So instead of instead of time of use, where you have your on-peak and off-peak pricing, you can go to a tiered plan, which is a flat single price that you pay no matter what time of day, with the only difference being there's different tiers based on how much electricity you use. So the bottom line is, no matter which of those RPP rates, the global adjustment amount is kind of buried within that, and it's calculated to blend it over for all of us on a 6 to 12 month basis. And we really don't see it. Just like we don't see fluctuations in pricing day to day. It doesn't matter if it's hot or cold or sunny or rainy. We don't see a difference in our price. So then the second type of rate structure is what's called a Class B customer. Class B are typically mid-sized power consumers, right? Small, medium-sized businesses, maybe condo buildings, that kind of thing. So it's a customer who consumes between 50 kilowatts and maybe a couple megawatts of power. These are different than RPP customers because they are exposed to both the fluctuations in the energy price, the hourly Ontario energy price, HOA, and the fluctuations in global adjustment. So Class B customers, they pay when they're consuming power what the actual cost of power is on an hourly basis. And it can fluctuate. Some days it could be very high on a really hot day with high demand. And some days it could be very, very low and much less than we pay as RPP. But they're subject to those fluctuations. Similarly on GA, each month Class B customers get sort of their portion of the GA is allocated to all Class B. It's blended into a rate and divided by all of the kilowatt hours that the Class Bs consume. And so their GA amount will fluctuate month to month based on how much GA there is and how much Class B consumers use. So the big difference between both RPP and Class B customers, their GA is allocated based on the volume of electricity they use. Class B, they see more fluctuations than RPP customers. And then finally is the third class of customers called Class A customers. These are the big, large power consumers. These are the big factories, energy intensive industries. They're the ones who individual facilities have to be using at least on average 1 megawatt of power and are often consuming much more than that. Now, these large businesses have been given the opportunity to choose to be a Class A, in which case their global adjustment is allocated completely differently. They still pay for their energy, the HOEP, exactly the same way as Class B, but their amount of global adjustment is allocated based on how much power their facility is using at the same time, the same 5 hours that Ontario's overall grid was using the most power in the year. And so each year, the ISO looks back and they say, okay, these were the top 5 hours where Ontario grid was using the most power. Then the LDC, the person the Class A customer is buying their power from, maybe Hydro One, maybe Toronto Hydro, they look back and they say, hey, what were you using during those 5 hours? and they basically calculate a ratio. They say, well, you are using 1% of the Ontario grid. Now, the next year, that Class A customer pays 1% of the global adjustment. The idea is they're paying their share of how much of the peak demand they are driving. And so that's a very different mechanism than all the other rate classes, because it's not based on the volume of electricity. It's based on how much they're using during the peak times on the grid. And the concept behind that is the peak demand times drive most of the cost of maintaining our grid. We have to build enough transmission, distribution, and generation for those peak times. And so since the cost of getting all these generators are built are approximately what we have in global adjustment, let's allocate it based on that. So that's the concept behind Class A. And that covers the three main classes and how this big multi-billion-dollar account of global adjustment gets spread out amongst all of them.
Thanks. That's a very solid and thorough explanation. So if I get it right, we've got three classes. We've got the RPP customers they're basically, you use a kilowatt hour. Baked in there is your energy cost and your global adjustment. It all looks the same. If you're Class B, you're a large, slightly larger customer. There you're exposed to a bit more of the volatility around the energy price and also what's happening with the global adjustment. But you're still being billed volumetrically the amount that you're using. And then finally, the Class A's billed very differently. There, that GA is very much determined. It is determined based on how much power they're consuming during the top 5 hours of the year to deal with this capacity issue. So very, very different. So then, we know then that the Class A customers are incentivized to reduce their power consumption during these top 5 hours. So what does that mean then for other ratepayers, right? So if a customer is paying less, Class A customers paying less global adjustment, does that then mean that same amount of GA cost is being borne by the Class Bs and RPPs?
Not exactly. Not exactly, and that I think is probably one of the more maybe controversial and sometimes misunderstood aspects of the program. So it is absolutely true that by lowering the individual costs for Class A consumers, that there's more global adjustment to be allocated elsewhere. But this is very much not a zero-sum game. So it doesn't mean that the savings from Class A are passed directly on to the other consumers. The whole point, the whole design behind the Class A structure is that by reducing during peak hours, Class A customers are actually doing a favor for the Ontario grid as a whole, because we don't have to build new transmission systems. We don't have to build new generators. And so we save money as a whole. So I think you cited at the beginning, Cam, what was the number for the total cost of the Ontario electricity system annually? Was it 18 billion?
Yeah.
So if we didn't have a program that reduced those peaks, that number would be higher. I don't know what it would be, but it wouldn't be 18 billion, maybe it would be 20 billion, right? And so to give you a sense of that, right, currently Class A customers on those peak days are reducing 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts of demand. Now that 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts demand is especially important right now when we as a province have major capacity needs coming up and emerging very soon. And so by reducing that 1,500, 2,000 megawatts, we haven't had to build additional generation. It just isn't here. And the costs of that generation don't exist for Class A, Class B, or RPP customers. And like give you a sense, well, what is 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts, right? Well, Darlington nuclear plant's currently being refurbished. It was built decades ago. It was, I think, cost about $14-15 billion to build many decades ago. And it's about 3,000 or 3,500, right? So the response from Class A is about half the size of a very large nuclear power plant. And we haven't had to build that scale of additional generation. So those costs are being saved for everyone and keeping the overall cost down. So it's not zero sum. There's some truth to that shift, but it is absolutely far from zero sum. And I would say the other thing we've seen, certainly in our work, is that in addition to having the Class A structure, which has encouraged people to avoid those peaks, has spurred on a bunch of innovation that we see in our work on an ongoing basis. And that innovation has been businesses figuring out how they can change their operations so they have the flexibility to avoid those peaks, installing technology like batteries behind the meter. And so not only have we reduced those peaks, but that capability is becoming more and more useful to the Ontario grid on an ongoing basis. And so there's even further benefits than just avoiding that. So certainly I would make the argument that that the structure has benefits to everyone, and it's not just here passing the buck to the next guy.
So, Aaron, you mentioned that sort of the size of the response that this sort of a Class A peak avoidance, the top five peaks has created in Ontario. Given that, there's a lot of interest in the global adjustment. There's a lot of dollars on the line. There's a lot of investment being made in new technologies to assist and grow that that current 1,500 or so megawatts that you mentioned. So then the big question is, where's the GA going, right? What do you think folks should know and be thinking about as we consider global adjustment in the coming years?
Hey, there's a interesting question, and if I definitely knew the answer, we'd be in a great shape. But here's the bottom line: the costs that make up global adjustment fundamentally aren't going anywhere. Right? They're there. We have to make these generators, these make-whole payments, unless we see the cost of energy, HOEP, go way up. So what dynamics do you have to look at to judge that? Well, certain generation sources have very low marginal operating costs, right? So once you build a wind or solar, the cost, because they have no fuel, the cost of the energy is nearly free. Hydroelectric and even nuclear, after it's built, the cost of generation is very low. High upfront costs, very low operating costs. Natural gas, on the other hand, usually costs less to build, much more to operate and to generate that power. And so in the coming years in Ontario, we're going to see some of our nuclear fleet at Pickering retire. It's going to be out of the supply mix. And we're also doing some long refurbishments at Darlington and Bruce to keep those going for much longer. Well, during that period, when those nukes are not online, that means the natural gas fleet is going to have to operate more hours across the year, which will push HOEP up. So that would be something that would drive global adjustment down. So that's one force that you have to look at. The second, and this is the counter force, is the ISO has identified some pretty significant capacity needs we need starting in the middle of this decade and certainly by the end of this decade. And we're talking thousands of megawatts in additional capacity. And so that's going to come from somewhere, from something. And what that is, I would say, still remains to be seen. Is that going to be more wind and solar? Is that going to be batteries? Is that going to be new gas plants built? And we don't know yet. And we also don't know what the contract structure for those new assets are going to be. But we do know that there's going to be money spent building out that new capacity. And it just like now, those costs are going to have to be recovered somehow. So all that to say, I'm going to make maybe a boring prediction to say that I think we're going to see global adjustment be fairly steady over the next kind of 5-year period. I don't think we'll see any huge swings up or down. And then as we get past that, there's a lot of things that I don't know yet, and I don't think anyone knows yet, which is how is Ontario going to meet that capacity need in the future, and how are those contracts going to be structured? But I think the days of rapid GA growth, those are behind us. I think any hope of significant GA decline is probably also unlikely, and we're going to sit in a period where the GA has come down a lot from where it was, and it's more likely to stay relatively stable at that level for a period of time.
That's great. Thanks. So likely to stay stable, but you wouldn't you wouldn't bet the farm on it.
Yeah, I would not be. I would. I would not be willing to make a bet one way or the other. There's too many things that can swing, right? Like who would have ever thought, or I mean, maybe someone thought it, but oil and gas prices either shooting way up or coming down actually impact GA because the cost of the natural gas generation could change significantly. So if we see natural gas return to much more expensive levels, massive impact on GA. I certainly have no forecast on that, right? Or if we have tons of supply as we have in a while, then natural gas remains inexpensive and GA stays high. So there's so many factors. I wouldn't make a bet. I wouldn't recommend anyone making a really strong bet other than to know that it's still those costs, the costs we have, are locked in and fairly stable and are unlikely to change significantly in sort of the medium term, let's say.
Well, thanks for diving into this, Aaron. And I think this was a fun and interesting first topic to explore, and certainly something that a lot of people have on their mind, especially this time of year as the Class A folks start thinking about the top 5 peaks of the year, which often happen in the summertime. So, we're going to be doing another Energy Toolkit podcast in the next few weeks. So thanks very much, Aaron, for your time today and your input. And thanks to our listeners. Look forward to speaking to you soon. In the meantime, visit us at workbenchenergy.com.